Picture this. The year is 1973. In the heart of Africa, in a country the size of Western Europe, a man holds a press conference. He is draped in a tailored abacost suit, no tie, no Western collar, because he has personally banned the necktie as a symbol of colonialism. On his head sits a hat made from the skin of a leopard, the most feared predator of the African jungle. Behind him, a portrait of himself, enormous, inescapable, stares down at the assembled journalists. Around his neck hangs a carved walking stick he never sets down in public. His name, the one he gave himself, translates roughly as the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. His name is Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu wa Zabanga. The world once called him Joseph Desire Mobutu. He ruled the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which he renamed Zaire, for 32 years. He turned a nation of extraordinary natural wealth into one of the most comprehensively looted states in modern history. He built himself palaces in the jungle while hospitals ran out of bandages. He was celebrated at the White House, fêted at the Élysée Palace, and consulted by Cold War strategists as an indispensable partner. He was simultaneously a Pan-African symbol of decolonization and one of the most successful kleptocrats the 20th century ever produced. He was not simply a villain in a simple story. He was something far more complicated and far more instructive. This is a story about power, how it is seized, how it is performed, how it corrupts, and ultimately, how it collapses. But it is also a story about a continent at the crossroads of two competing imperial systems, a country born in chaos, and a man who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone of his era, that in post-colonial Africa, politics was not governance. It was theater. And for 3 decades, Mobutu ran the most elaborate theater on the continent. To understand how he rose, we have to go back, not just to his birth, but to the world that made him possible. The Congo Free State, later renamed the Belgian Congo, was, by any honest measure, one of the most brutal colonial enterprises in human history. Beginning in 1885 under the personal ownership of Belgian King Leopold II, the region was not governed as a colony in the traditional sense. It was managed as a private profit extraction machine. Workers who failed to meet rubber quotas had their hands cut off. Villages that resisted were burned. By conservative scholarly estimates, the population of the Congo Basin fell by 10 million people in the space of 2 decades, through murder, starvation, disease, and the sheer physical destruction wrought by Leopold's force public. By the time Belgium formally absorbed the colony in 1908, under international pressure following the exposure of Leopold's atrocities by activists like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement, the damage was done. The Congo had been introduced to the modern world not as a partner in civilization, as colonial rhetoric claimed, but as a resource to be stripped. That foundational relationship, the Congo as object rather than subject, as wealth to be extracted rather than a society to be developed, would echo, with terrible persistence, through everything that followed. It was into this world, in the small riverside town of Lisala in the Equateur province, that Joseph Desire Mobutu was born on October 14, 1930. His father, Alberic Bamani, was a cook employed by European administrators. He died when Joseph was 8 years old. His mother, Marie-Madeleine Yema, was a domestic worker and later an innkeeper. She was a woman of considerable resilience, and by most accounts, the dominant influence of his early life. Mobutu attended Catholic missionary schools, where he demonstrated an aptitude for French language and a restless, questioning intelligence. He was bright, ambitious, and deeply aware, from a young age, of the hierarchies that governed colonial life. Africans occupied the bottom of every structure. European missionaries taught, European administrators governed, European companies profited. The most an ambitious Congolese man could hope for, in the world of the 1940s, was a clerical position in the colonial bureaucracy. Mobutu aimed for exactly that, and exceeded it. In 1950, after persistent disciplinary conflicts at his missionary school, he was suspended multiple times, reportedly for insubordination. Mobutu was conscripted into the force publique, the colonial army. He served for 7 years, reaching the rank of sergeant major, the highest rank then available to Congolese soldiers. This is a fact worth pausing on. The Belgian colonial system, as late as the 1950s, did not train African officers. It trained African soldiers to be commanded by European officers. Mobutu's ceiling, by colonial design, was the rank just below those who actually held power. It was a structure designed to produce resentment. And in Mobutu, it produced exactly that, channeled, strategically, into ambition. After his military service, Mobutu worked as a journalist in Leopoldville, the colonial capital, writing for a number of newspapers and developing the rhetorical fluency and public presence that would later define his rule. He was a skilled writer, a charismatic presence, and a keen observer of how power moved. It was through journalism that he came into contact with the independence movement that was beginning to stir across Belgian Congo, and it was through that movement that he met the man who would define his political life. Patrice Lumumba was everything colonial Belgian Congo was not supposed to produce. A former postal clerk from Kasai province, he was brilliant, incandescent, and dangerous. Dangerous in the specific sense that he believed, with total conviction, that the Congolese people deserved immediate, unqualified, and uncompromising independence. He was not interested in partnership with Belgium, or in a gradual transition managed by Europeans. He was interested in sovereignty. Full stop. Mobutu and Lumumba met in the late 1950s and formed a relationship that was, depending on which historian you consult, a genuine friendship, a strategic alliance, or both. Lumumba became the head of the Mouvement National Congolese, the MNC, one of the few truly pan-Congolese political parties, and Mobutu became one of its members. When the Belgian government, under sudden and intense pressure from a wave of nationalist movements across Africa, agreed to grant the Congo independence in 1960, with astonishing speed and remarkably little preparation, it was Lumumba who emerged as the dominant political figure. On June 30, 1960, the Republic of the Congo became independent. Lumumba became Prime Minister. Joseph Kasavubu became President. And Joseph Desire Mobutu became, through Lumumba's patronage, the Army's Chief of Staff, Colonel Mobutu. But independence, as Lumumba discovered almost immediately, was not simply a transfer of flags. It was the inheritance of a state that had been deliberately built to extract, not to govern. The Congo at independence had fewer than 30 university graduates. It had no indigenous officer corps. It had no trained civil service to speak of. The Belgians had built roads, railways, and mines, but they had built them for Belgian purposes. The administrative infrastructure of the state was so thoroughly European that when Belgian officials left, which they did rapidly and chaotically in the wake of independence, they left an institutional void that no nascent government could reasonably have filled. The Congo crisis began almost immediately. On July 5, 1960, 5 days after independence, Congolese soldiers in the force publique mutinied against their remaining Belgian officers. The province of Katanga, home to the vast majority of the Congo's mineral wealth, copper, cobalt, uranium, declared secession under Moise Tshombe, with what most historians now consider clear Belgian and mining company support. The province of South Kasai followed. The country was disintegrating. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations, which sent troops, but the UN mission, under Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, operated under a mandate that prevented it from directly assisting the Congolese government in suppressing the Katanga secession. Lumumba, in desperation, then did the thing that sealed his fate in the eyes of Washington and Brussels. He reached out to the Soviet Union for military assistance. In the logic of 1960, in the zero-sum arithmetic of the Cold War, This was not merely a diplomatic decision. It was a sentence. The United States, under the Eisenhower administration, concluded that Lumumba was either a communist or dangerously susceptible to communist influence. The CIA station chief in Leopoldville, Lawrence Devlin, later confirmed that Washington had authorized plans to have Lumumba removed, and that the word "removed" was used as a euphemism. The historical record on direct American involvement in Lumumba's death remains contested. Some documents have been released, others remain classified, and the precise chain of events involves multiple actors with overlapping motivations. What is not contested is the outcome. In September 1960, President Kasavubu moved to dismiss Lumumba from the government. The constitutional legality of this move was disputed. Lumumba refused to recognize it, and for a brief period the country had two governments each claiming legitimacy. It was at this moment that Colonel Mobutu made his first move. On September 14, 1960, Mobutu announced what he called a peaceful revolution. He suspended both Kasavubu and Lumumba, expelled Soviet and Czechoslovak diplomats, and handed day-to-day government to a college of commissioners, university students and graduates drafted to run the administration. This was, in retrospect, the moment that separated Mobutu from every other figure in the crisis. He had not merely picked a side in a political dispute. He had demonstrated a willingness to seize the machinery of the state by force, and then, crucially, to step back from it. For now, Mobutu restored Kasavubu to power within months. It was a tactically brilliant move. He had shown that he could act decisively, neutralize the Soviet presence, and still return to the barracks, all of which made him, from the perspective of Washington and Brussels, the most reassuring figure in Congolese politics. The CIA's Lawrence Devlin reportedly developed a close working relationship with Mobutu during this period. The precise nature of American financial and intelligence support in these months is, again, a matter of ongoing historical debate, but the broad shape of the relationship, American backing for an anti-communist military strongman, is well established. Lumumba, placed under UN protective custody after being stripped of power, attempted to flee to his political stronghold in Stanleyville. He was captured by Congolese government forces in December 1960. On January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba was executed, shot in the presence of Katongan officials and, according to some accounts, Belgian officers. His body was subsequently dissolved in acid. He was 35 years old. The murder of Patrice Lumumba is one of the most consequential political killings of the 20th century. Not because it was unusual in an era of Cold War assassinations, but because of what it foreclosed. Lumumba was the only leader of the independence era who had articulated a genuinely national, rather than tribal or regional, vision for the Congo. Whatever his political naivety, and he was, in many ways, dangerously naive about the geopolitical forces aligned against him, he represented a road not taken. What came after him was, in part, the consequence of that road being closed. Mobutu returned to the barracks. But he had learned something in September 1960 that he would never forget. The army was the real state. Everything else was negotiable. Between 1960 and 1965, the Republic of the Congo lurched from crisis to crisis. The Katanga secession was finally suppressed in 1963 with direct UN military intervention, but the political settlement was fragile. Regional militias, particularly the Simba rebellion in the east, which drew on Lumumba's sentiment and, according to some reports, Marxist ideology, continued to destabilize large parts of the country. Elections in 1965 produced a parliamentary result that satisfied almost no one. Cyril Adoula's government gave way to Moise Tshombe's, a former secessionist who was now, surreally, prime minister of the country he had tried to break apart. President Kasavubu then moved to dismiss Tshombe. The political class of Congo was consuming itself. Into this chaos, on November 24, 1965, General Mobutu moved again. This time, There would be no return to the barracks. The coup was almost surgically clean. Mobutu's soldiers secured the radio station, the airport, and key government buildings in Leopoldville without significant resistance. Kasavubu was placed under house arrest and subsequently allowed to retire peacefully. Chombe was in exile. The army moved as one, because Mobutu had spent the intervening years ensuring that it did, building personal loyalty, distributing patronage, and making himself indispensable to the institution that mattered most. He announced over radio that the army was taking power for 5 years, just long enough to stabilize the country before returning it to civilian rule. It was a statement that would age very poorly. The 5 years became 32. Why did the coup succeed? There are several layers of explanation, and responsible historical analysis requires distinguishing between them. At the most immediate level, it succeeded because Mobutu had built a loyal military constituency, because the civilian political system had exhausted its legitimacy through years of dysfunction, and because the army faced no meaningful resistance. At the structural level, it succeeded because the Congo's institutional inheritance from colonialism was so thin that the army was, genuinely, the most coherent institution the state possessed. Where other post-colonial states inherited a civil service, a legal tradition, even a partially trained professional class, the Congo's colonial masters had deliberately cultivated none of these. The army was what existed. Mobutu controlled the army. The logic is bleak but coherent. And at the geopolitical level, which no honest account can ignore, the coup succeeded because the United States and Belgium did not want it to fail. This is where the historical record becomes simultaneously clearer and more contested. What is clear? The Johnson administration in Washington viewed Congo as strategically critical. Its mineral wealth, its geographic centrality in Africa, and its potential as either an anti-communist bulwark or a Soviet foothold made it a priority. What is also clear? American intelligence agencies had maintained a close relationship with Mobutu since at least 1960. What remains disputed? The precise degree to which the CIA actively facilitated, encouraged, or merely acquiesced in the 1965 coup, as opposed to simply responding enthusiastically to an outcome they preferred. Historians including Ludo DeWitt and John Stockwell, the latter a former CIA officer, have argued that American intelligence involvement was substantial. The official American position has historically denied direct operational involvement in the coup itself while acknowledging the warm relationship that followed it. The full truth may never be recoverable from declassified documents alone. What is not in dispute is what came next. Within months of the coup, American economic aid to Congo increased significantly. The World Bank engaged constructively with the new regime. Western governments that had been watching the parliamentary chaos with growing alarm suddenly found a partner they could work with. Mobutu had passed his audition. Now he had to build his state. What Mobutu built after 1965 was not, in the technical sense, a conventional military dictatorship. It was something stranger and more personal, a system that scholars have variously called the Mobutu system, the politics of the belly, and most precisely, kleptocracy, rule by theft. But to understand how that system functioned, you first have to understand the ideology he wrapped around it, because Mobutu was shrewd enough to know that naked power, unadorned, is always vulnerable. Power requires legitimacy. And legitimacy, in post-colonial Africa, required a story. Mobutu's story was Authenticity. Launched formally in 1971, it was a sweeping ideological program rooted in the assertion that Africa needed to reject the cultural inheritance of colonialism and return to its own values, its own identity, its own name for itself. On paper, and indeed in some of its philosophical content, it was not entirely without intellectual merit. The critique of colonial cultural erasure was genuine and widely shared across Africa. The argument that Africans should define themselves on their own terms rather than through European frameworks resonated powerfully. In practice, Authenticite manifested in a series of highly visible and deliberately theatrical changes. The country was renamed. The Democratic Republic of the Congo became the Republic of Zaire, a name derived, somewhat loosely, from a Portuguese corruption of a Kikongo word for the Great River. The capital, Leopoldville, named after the king responsible for the most devastating period in Congolese history, became Kinshasa. Stanleyville became Kisangani. Elizabethville became Lubumbashi. European place names, European saints' names, out. African names, back. And then, most symbolically, Mobutu changed his own name. Joseph Desire Mobutu became Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu wa Zabunga, in the Ngbandi language of his home region, a name that his official biographers translated with only mild embarrassment. He ordered all Congolese citizens to abandon their Christian names, which he characterized as colonial impositions, and take African names instead. He banned the necktie as a Western symbol and replaced it with the abacoste, from the French abas le costume, meaning down with the suit, a Mao-style tunic that he personally modeled and promoted. He positioned himself, with extraordinary audacity, not merely as a head of state but as a near-mystical figure, the embodiment of the nation itself. State television opened its nightly broadcast with an image of Mobutu's face descending, literally, through clouds. His portrait hung in every public building, every school, every government office. He was referred to in official rhetoric as the guide, the helmsman, the father of the nation. When he visited a village, local officials were expected to greet him with song and dance. When he addressed the nation, state television cut away to slow-motion footage of him gesturing beatifically while choirs sang his praises. The cult of personality was not unique to Mobutu in this era. Kwame Nkrumah, Hastings Banda, Jean Bedel Bokassa, and Kim Il-sung were all contemporaneous practitioners of the form. But Mobutu's version was notable for its self-awareness. Unlike some leaders who seem to genuinely believe their own mythology, there are strong indications, from former aides and journalists who knew him, that Mobutu understood the performance as performance. He used it deliberately, instrumentally, as a mechanism of power rather than as an expression of sincere belief. In 1967, he formalized the political system by creating the Mouvement Populaire de la Révolution, the MPR, as the sole legal political party. By 1970, membership in the MPR was declared automatic at birth for every Zairean citizen. There was no joining required. You were born Zairean. You were a member of the MPR. The party and the state became, legally, identical. There was no public space outside the party, because there was no public space outside the state, because there was no state outside Mobutu. This consolidation was accompanied by the systematic dismantling of any institution that might serve as a counterweight to executive power. The judiciary was hollowed out. Judges who ruled against the government found their careers, and sometimes their liberty, at risk. The press was brought under state control. Universities were purged of faculty who expressed dissent. Traditional chiefs were incorporated into the party structure, their authority made dependent on their loyalty to the regime. The Catholic Church, historically the most independent institution in the country, was brought into a prolonged and occasionally bitter conflict with the government, as Mobutu attempted, with mixed success, to subordinate it to state authority. The economic dimension of this period is where Mobutu's state-building and his system of extraction became most visibly intertwined. In 1966 and 1967, he nationalized several foreign-owned companies, including assets of the powerful Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, the mining conglomerate that had controlled Katanga's mineral wealth during the colonial period. These nationalizations were presented as acts of economic sovereignty, and in their immediate political context, they generated genuine popular support. Then, in 1973 and 1974, came Zaireanization, a sweeping program that transferred foreign-owned businesses to Zairean citizens. In principle, this was a decolonization of the economy. getting African hands on African assets. In practice, the businesses were transferred overwhelmingly to Mobutu's political allies, military officers, and family members. People who, in many cases, had no knowledge of the industries they suddenly owned. The results were swift and predictable. Businesses that had been productive under foreign management collapsed under new owners who stripped them for short-term profit rather than maintaining them as going concerns. By 1975, Mobutu was partially reversing Zaireanization, inviting some foreign owners back under new terms. The economy had been destabilized, but the political elite had been enriched. From Mobutu's perspective, this was not a policy failure. It was a policy success. The political scientist Jean-François Bayart, writing about post-colonial African governance, coined the phrase, the politics of the belly. The idea that African states in this era were not failing to govern so much as they were governing in a particular way, through the distribution of state resources to political allies, the extraction of rents from economic activity, and the maintenance of loyalty through material reward rather than institutional legitimacy. Mobutu's Zaire was, in Bayart's framework, not a dysfunctional state. It was a state that functioned precisely as its ruler intended, as a vehicle for accumulation. The mechanisms of that accumulation were breathtaking in their scale and their brazenness. At the top of the system sat Mobutu himself. He maintained direct personal control over the revenues generated by Gécamines, the state copper and cobalt mining company that had absorbed the nationalized assets of the old Union Minière. He controlled the diamond trade, the oil revenues from the offshore Bakongo fields, and, according to multiple journalistic and academic investigations, took a direct cut from contracts awarded by the state for infrastructure, imports, and military procurement. The American economist Thomas Callaghan, who studied Zaire extensively in the 1980s, estimated that Mobutu personally siphoned somewhere between $4 and $15 billion from the Zairean state over the course of his rule, a range that reflects genuine uncertainty in the underlying data, but which in either direction represents an almost incomprehensible extraction from a country whose majority population lived in poverty. The most vivid symbol of this extraction was Gbadolite, a city, essentially, that Mobutu built from scratch in the jungle of Equateur province, near his birthplace of Lisala. Gbadolite was home to multiple presidential palaces, one for Mobutu himself, others for visiting dignitaries and his extensive family, along with a Catholic basilica, a sports complex, a zoo, and most strikingly, an airport runway long enough to accommodate the Concorde supersonic jet, which Mobutu chartered from Air France for personal travel. The cost of building and maintaining Gbadolite, in a country with no reliable electricity grid in most of its territory, no functioning national road network, and a healthcare system in terminal collapse, has never been precisely calculated. It was, in both literal and metaphorical terms, a jungle fantasy paid for by a people who were not consulted. But it would be an oversimplification to present Mobutu's corruption as a purely personal pathology visited upon an otherwise healthy system. The genius, if that word is permissible here, of the Mobutu system was that it was not just Mobutu stealing. It was everyone stealing, in a structured hierarchy. Regional governors took their cut of provincial revenues before remitting anything to Kinshasa. Military commanders ran local rackets, checkpoints, protection demands, extortion of traders. Civil servants who received their salaries irregularly, and they frequently did not receive them at all, were implicitly permitted to extract money from the citizens they were supposed to serve. Doctors charged for free medicines. Teachers sold grades. Police officers detained civilians for imaginary offenses and released them upon payment. This was not simply corruption in the sense of occasional deviation from institutional norms. It was the replacement of the state itself with a system of organized predation. And Mobutu tolerated, indeed, encouraged, it because it served a political function. An official who had been permitted to steal was an official who was dependent on the continuation of the regime that permitted him to steal. Loyalty was purchased not with salaries but with opportunities for extraction. The state was deliberately cannibalized to produce political loyalty. The institutional consequences were catastrophic. By the late 1970s, Zaire had one of the highest debt-to-GDP ratios in sub-Saharan Africa, despite being one of the richest countries on the continent in terms of raw resource endowment. The copper price crash of the mid-1970s, a genuinely external shock, accelerated a fiscal crisis that was already structural in nature. The state payroll existed in name but not always in fact. The road network, which had been the Congo's most impressive legacy from the colonial period, deteriorated rapidly because maintenance budgets were diverted. By the 1980s, it was estimated that fewer miles of road in Zaire were passable than had been passable at independence in 1960. The health system followed a similar trajectory. Missionary hospitals and clinics, which had historically provided much of the country's medical care, struggled as international funding was redirected or exhausted. State hospitals in Kinshasa, the capital, the showpiece city, ran short of the most basic supplies. A country sitting above some of the world's most valuable mineral deposits could not reliably supply antibiotics to its public hospitals. This is not a paradox. It is the precise, predictable outcome of a state designed to extract rather than to provide. The 1980s brought Mobutu a series of converging crises that he had neither the capacity nor, arguably, the will to address. The external environment, which had long been his greatest asset, began to shift against him. The collapse of global copper prices in the mid-1970s had already damaged Zaire's export revenues severely. The country turned to international lenders, the IMF, the World Bank, Western commercial banks, for balance of payments support. The resulting relationship was simultaneously financially necessary and politically corrosive. The IMF imposed structural adjustment conditions that required cuts to public spending, devaluation of the currency, and liberalization of trade, all of which reduced the state's capacity to distribute patronage while increasing the hardship experienced by ordinary Zairians. Mobutu engaged with international financial institutions in what can only be described as bad faith. He would agree to conditions when agreement was necessary to unlock the next tranche of loans, implement reforms long enough to demonstrate superficial compliance, then abandon them when the immediate financial pressure eased. The IMF and World Bank, under Cold War incentive structures, continued to engage with Zaire despite the obvious absence of genuine reform commitment, because the alternative, from Washington's perspective, was a Zaire that turned to Moscow. This dynamic, Western financial institutions lending to a kleptocracy they knew was a kleptocracy because the geopolitical alternative was worse, is one of the most important and least flattering chapters in the history of international development finance. Scholars including Michaela Wrong and James Wolfenzone have documented the degree to which Western creditors, both public and private, effectively subsidized Mobutu's regime for decades while maintaining the fiction that their engagement was conditional on governance improvements. Domestically, the 1980s saw the gradual exhaustion of the tools Mobutu had used to maintain order. The political elite, which had been kept loyal through opportunities for extraction, began to fracture as the available rents declined with the economy. A new generation of Zairians, many educated abroad, all formed in the decade since independence, had no particular reason to accept the bargain their parents had accepted. Etienne Tshisekedi wa Mulumba, a former justice minister who had become the country's most visible opposition figure, founded the Union pour la démocratie et le progrès social, the UDPS, in 1982. He was repeatedly arrested, exiled, and harassed, but he did not stop. The regime's response to his persistence was telling. It lacked the comprehensive ruthlessness that would have been needed to silence him permanently, and it lacked the legitimacy to co-opt him. And then, in 1989, the world changed. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union began its final, terminal decomposition. The Cold War, the geopolitical framework within which Mobutu's value to the West had been calculated, was over. And without the Cold War, Western governments were suddenly able to look at their relationship with Mobutu and see it for what it was, a 30-year subsidy to one of the world's most successful kleptocrats, in exchange for the dubious privilege of calling him an ally. The reassessment was neither instant nor complete, but it was real. The United States began, for the first time, to apply genuine pressure on Mobutu for political reform. The European community, and individual European governments, began to reduce bilateral aid. In 1990, under this combined international pressure and mounting domestic protest, Mobutu announced the end of the one-party state and the beginning of a transition to multi-party democracy. It was, most analysts agreed, a tactical concession rather than a genuine conversion. But it opened a space that had not existed before. The transition process became a years-long political theater of its own. A national conference, the Conference Nationale Souveraine, convened in 1992 with delegates from across Zairean civil society, and produced an extraordinary moment: the election of Etienne Tshisekedi as prime minister by the conference delegates. Mobutu refused to recognize the appointment, dismissed Tshisekedi, reinstated him under pressure, dismissed him again. The transition became a labyrinth of bad faith negotiations, broken agreements, and manufactured crises. Mobutu was not ready to leave, and he still controlled the army. Or at least, he controlled enough of it. It was during this period, the late 1980s and early 1990s, that one of the most remarkable and often overlooked aspects of Mobutu Zaire became fully visible: the relationship between the regime and the country's extraordinary musical culture. Zaire, despite, or perhaps because of, the comprehensive failure of its state institutions, produced one of the 20th century's most original and globally influential musical traditions. Congolese rumba, which evolved into soukous, blended Cuban rhythms imported through phonograph records with Congolese traditional music and French lyrical traditions to create something entirely new. Artists like Franco Luambo Makiadi, known simply as Franco, Grand Kali, Papa Wemba, and Tabou Le Rochereau achieved genuine continental stardom, their music spreading across Africa and eventually reaching Europe and the Americas. Mobutu understood the political utility of this culture and engaged with it with characteristic ambiguity. On one hand, he patronized musicians directly. Franco in particular performed official praise songs for the regime, songs that celebrated the guide and his Authenticity program. This was not entirely involuntary. The relationship between powerful patrons and musicians in many African traditions made the line between genuine artistic collaboration and political co-optation genuinely blurry. Franco also produced sharp social commentary and even, in some songs, veiled critique of official corruption, material that required navigating the regime's tolerance carefully. On the other hand, the music scene gave ordinary Zaireans something the state entirely failed to provide: a sense of cultural pride, community, and joy. In a country where the electricity grid was unreliable, where hospitals were crumbling, where the currency was in freefall, where the police were a predatory force rather than a protective one, the bars and live music venues of Kinshasa were packed. This was not simply escapism, though it was partly that. It was a form of cultural resilience, a society generating, outside the state, the vitality that the state had utterly failed to nurture. The music, like so much of Zaire, contained the full paradox of the Mobutu era: genuine creativity and beauty coexisting with political corruption and instrumentalization. Artists navigated impossible conditions with extraordinary resourcefulness. When Papa Wemba, perhaps the most internationally successful artist to emerge from this era, built his global career singing in Lingala and dressed in the extraordinary sartorial extravagance of the sapeur movement, he was doing something that was simultaneously apolitical and profoundly political: asserting African dignity through art, even as the state responsible for African dignity had hollowed itself out. By the early 1990s, the economic collapse was no longer theoretical. The Zairean currency, the Zaire, had been subjected to such sustained inflation that by 1993 the government was issuing 5 million Zaire banknotes that were worth almost nothing. Soldiers, unpaid for months, mutinied repeatedly. In 1991 and 1993, military pillaging of Kinshasa, soldiers simply looting the city they were theoretically protecting, caused massive property destruction and triggered a collapse of what remained of the formal economy. Foreign nationals were evacuated. Embassies reduced their staff. The country was imploding in slow motion. And Mobutu, increasingly ill. He had been diagnosed with prostate cancer in 1996, though symptoms had been present for years, retreated more and more to Gbadolite, to his yacht on the Congo River, to his villas in France and Switzerland. He governed less and less, which meant that in the hollow state he had created, there was almost nothing left to govern. The blow, when it finally came, did not come from within Kinshasa. It came from the east, from the border with Rwanda, in the aftermath of one of the 20th century's most catastrophic events. In 1994, the Rwandan genocide killed between 500,000 and 800,000 Tutsi people and moderate Hutu in approximately 100 days. When the genocide ended, stopped by the military victory of the Rwandan Patriotic Front under Paul Kagame, approximately 2 million Hutu refugees flooded into eastern Zaire. Among them were large numbers of the genocidaires, the Interahamwe militias and former Rwandan army soldiers responsible for the genocide. These forces reorganized in the refugee camps of North and South Kivu, using them as bases to continue attacking Rwanda and to prey on the local Congolese Tutsi, the Banyamulenge, who had lived in eastern Zaire for generations. Rwanda and Uganda, both with governments that had come to power through military insurgency and had no patience for the threat that the genocidaire presence in eastern Zaire represented, concluded by 1996 that Mobutu's state, which was either unable or unwilling to address the problem, needed to be replaced. They found in eastern Zaire a vehicle for that replacement, a Congolese rebel movement called the Alliance de Forces Démocratiques pour la Libération du Congo Zaire, the AFDL, and at its head, a veteran Lumumbist rebel named Laurent Desire Kabila. Kabila was a complicated figure by any measure. He had been a rebel since the 1960s. Che Guevara, who spent several months in eastern Congo in 1965 attempting to assist a Lumumbist insurgency, wrote dismissively of him in his diary, calling him insufficiently committed to the revolution. Kabila had spent the intervening decades running a trading post of ambiguous legality near Lake Tanganyika. He was not, by most accounts, an ideologue. He was an opportunist, which, in the circumstances of 1996, made him exactly the instrument that Rwanda and Uganda needed. The First Congo War began in October 1996 and ended, with a speed that shocked almost everyone, in May 1997. The AFDL, backed by Rwandan and Ugandan regular forces, a fact that was not officially acknowledged at the time and remains the subject of some diplomatic sensitivity, swept across the country from east to west, covering thousands of miles in 7 months. Mobutu's army, unpaid, unfed, and led by officers whose principal qualification was political loyalty rather than military competence, dissolved almost on contact. Soldiers fled, surrendered, or simply changed sides. Mobutu, ill and abroad for extended periods of medical treatment, attempted to negotiate, meeting with Kabila on a South African naval vessel in May 1997, in a conference brokered by Nelson Mandela. The meeting produced nothing. Kabila had no incentive to negotiate. He was winning. On May 16, 1997, Mobutu Sese Seko left Kinshasa for the last time. He flew to Gbadolite, his jungle paradise, and then out of the country entirely. To Togo, then to Morocco, where King Hassan II, an old friend, offered him refuge. The following day, May 17, 1997, Laurent Desire Kabila entered Kinshasa and renamed the country once again. The Republic of Zaire became, again, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mobutu died in Rabat, Morocco, on September 7, 1997. He was 66 years old. The prostate cancer that had been diagnosed the previous year had progressed rapidly in the stress of his final months. He died in exile, stripped of his state, his palaces already being looted by the soldiers who had once guarded them. He was buried in Morocco. For years, his family requested that his remains be returned to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As of the time of this video's production, that has not happened. More than a quarter century has passed since Mobutu's fall. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, the country he ruled for 32 years, has not found peace. Laurent Desire Kabila was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards in 2001. His son, Joseph Kabila, ruled until 2019. Félix Tshisekedi, the son of Mobutu's great opponent, Etienne Tshisekedi, won elections in 2018 and 2023 in contests whose credibility remains disputed by independent observers. The Eastern Congo has been in a state of near-continuous armed conflict since 1996, involving dozens of armed groups, the armies of neighboring states, and United Nations peacekeeping missions that have been present for over 2 decades without resolving the underlying conflicts. The question of Mobutu's legacy is, at one level, grotesquely simple. He left the country dramatically worse than he found it by almost every measurable indicator. Infrastructure was more decayed, institutions were more hollowed out, public trust in the state was lower, the capacity for legitimate governance was thinner. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, at independence in 1960, was described by contemporaneous observers as underdeveloped but potentially viable as a state. After 32 years of Mobutu, it had to be reconstructed almost from scratch, and the reconstruction has been agonizingly incomplete. But the harder analytical question, the one that resists simple answers, is the question of causation. How much of the Congo's subsequent suffering is directly attributable to Mobutu's specific decisions, and how much is attributable to structural factors that his removal could not undo? The first school of interpretation, associated with scholars like Michaela Wrong, author of In the Footsteps of Mr. Kurtz, perhaps the most comprehensive journalistic account of the Mobutu era, emphasizes individual agency. Mobutu made choices. He chose to steal. He chose to dismantle institutions. He chose to appoint loyalists over competent administrators. He chose to subordinate the development of the state to the maintenance of his personal power. A different leader, making different choices, might have produced a different outcome. The second school of interpretation, associated with structural analysis in the tradition of scholars like Crawford Young, emphasizes the weight of what came before Mobutu. The Belgian colonial system had not merely failed to develop Congolese institutions, it had actively prevented their development. The Congo at independence had the thinnest human capital base of any decolonizing African state. The Cold War structures that immediately followed independence, including the murder of Lumumba, foreclosed the political possibilities that might have produced a different path. Mobutu was, in this reading, not the cause of the Congo's failure but its most acute expression, a product of a system that had been designed to produce extraction rather than governance. A third interpretation, associated with scholars of African political economy like Patrick Chabal and Jean-Pascal Delaz, suggests that the very concept of state failure applied to Zaire reflects a misunderstanding of what the state was doing. Mobutu's state did not fail to provide public goods. It succeeded in redistributing resources to a political elite and maintaining a form of social order that, however unjust, was legible and navigable to those who understood its rules. This reading is controversial. It risks normalizing kleptocracy by calling it functional, but it captures something real about how ordinary Zaireans experienced the Mobutu era, not as total chaos, but as a system with its own brutal logic. Comparison with other Cold War-era African leaders illuminates both what was common and what was distinctive about Mobutu. Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire was, like Mobutu, a Western-aligned African strongman who ruled for decades, from 1960 to 1993. He also presided over a personalized state with significant corruption and, near the end of his rule, built an extraordinarily expensive basilica in his home village of Yamoussoukro that rivaled St. Peter's in Rome in scale. And yet Côte d'Ivoire under Houphouët-Boigny was, for much of this period, economically viable, even prosperous by regional standards. The comparison suggests that the particular depth of Zaire's institutional collapse cannot be explained by Western patronage and authoritarianism alone. Something in the specific structure of Mobutu's system, its comprehensive subordination of every institution to personal loyalty, its refusal to invest in any capacity that might become independent, produced outcomes worse than those seen in comparable regimes. Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, both of whom ruled single-party states with authoritarian characteristics, left countries that, while far from ideal, retained functioning bureaucracies, independent judiciaries, and a basic civic culture that made subsequent democratization possible. Mobutu left none of these. This is the measure of his particular destructiveness. Not simply that he was an authoritarian, but that he was an authoritarian who was unusually systematic in destroying the conditions for his own succession. There is one more dimension of the legacy that demands attention: the resource question. The Democratic Republic of the Congo sits above an estimated $24 trillion worth of untapped mineral resources: cobalt, coltan, copper, gold, diamonds, and increasingly, the lithium and rare earth minerals essential for electric vehicles and renewable energy technologies. The country that is, in theory, one of the wealthiest on Earth by geological endowment remains one of the poorest by development indicators. The gap between these two facts, the resource wealth and the human poverty, is not adequately explained by Mobutu alone. But Mobutu's 32 years of extractive governance established the template, the institutional culture, and the international relationships through which that gap has been maintained and perpetuated. Every international mining company that operates in the DRC today, every coltan trader, every cobalt refinery in the supply chain of a smartphone or electric vehicle, they are operating within a system of resource governance whose basic structure was established under Mobutu. The people who mine cobalt by hand in Katanga, many of them children, for wages that a Western consumer of the products their labor produces would consider unimaginable. Their situation is not simply Mobutu's fault, but it is legible only in a context that he helped create. And what of the man himself? How should we hold Joseph Desire Mobutu, Mobutu Sese Seko, in historical memory? He was not, in the clinical sense, a mass murderer in the tradition of Stalin or Pol Pot. He did not preside over genocidal violence as a deliberate instrument of state policy, though he tolerated violence against dissidents and ethnic minorities. His evil was primarily economic and institutional: the systematic destruction of his country's capacity to care for its citizens, the theft of resources that could have funded schools and hospitals, the deliberate cultivation of a political culture in which predation was normalized and competence was threatening. He was also, genuinely, a man of remarkable political intelligence and personal charisma. Those who met him, including heads of state, journalists, and diplomats who were under no obligation to flatter him, consistently described a figure of formidable presence and strategic acuity. He understood power dynamics with an almost preternatural clarity. He navigated the Cold War with a sophistication that larger and better resourced states failed to achieve. He built a form of political loyalty, however corrupted, that held for 3 decades in a country that almost no one, at independence, believed could hold together for 3 years. What he lacked, and this may be the most honest epitaph available, was any sustained interest in the welfare of the people he ruled. He understood them as a resource, as an audience, as a variable to be managed. The Authenticity program dressed this indifference in the language of African dignity, which made it more effective as propaganda and more painful as betrayal. A leader who claims to speak for the authentic soul of his people while systematically robbing them has committed a particular kind of crime, not just against their bodies and their wallets, but against their imagination of what they could be. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is still, in 2024, working through the consequences of what Mobutu built and destroyed. Its people, resourceful, creative, resilient in ways that consistently confound outside observers, continue to build lives and cultures and communities in the spaces that the state has left vacant. The music continues. The markets continue. The art, the language, the profound vitality of a society that has endured more than almost any other in the modern era, these continue. Whether the state will ever become what it might have been is, genuinely, an open question. It is a question that Mobutu's choices made far harder to answer. He arrived in the world as the son of a cook in a colonial backwater. He seized the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa and held it for 32 years. He stole billions while his people went without medicine. He built a palace in the jungle and chartered the Concorde. He renamed a country, renamed himself, and tried to rename history. He died in exile, in someone else's country, a sick old man whose leopard skin hat was a museum piece and whose state had been dismantled within days of his departure. The lesson of Mobutu Sese Seko is not simply that power corrupts. That observation, true as it is too general to be useful. The lesson is more specific and more instructive. What a state is built for determines what it becomes. A state built around a single individual's survival and enrichment will inevitably hollow out every institution that might challenge that individual, and when that individual goes, it will have nothing left. The leopard consumed the forest. And when the leopard was gone, there was no forest. Mobutu Sese Seko died in exile in Rabat, Morocco, on September 7, 1997. Laurent Desire Kabila was assassinated in Kinshasa on January 16, 2001. The Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo remains in armed conflict. The DRC holds an estimated 70% of the world's cobalt reserves.